Hey, welcome to the Working World. I'm Keryn Mendez.
And I'm Jamie Lingham. We spoke with Dr. Agnes Arnold Foster this week on the show, and I've got to tell you, the whole world of vaccines. Dr. Foster, or Agnes as we'll just call her, she's a writer, a historian of healthcare. She's in medicine, work and emotions. Agnes has such an unbelievable view and history about vaccines and the evolution that we've gone through to get to this point.
Yeah, and I mean, look, hats off to her. When we spoke to her, I think it was 7 a.m. local time in London, and she was right in the middle of a lockdown herself. So big thanks and shout out to her for speaking with us. But yeah, Jamie, I really particularly enjoyed that, looking back and taking those learnings from past outbreaks and pandemics. And then also her view around what's coming and looking forward as well. That's insightful.
Yeah, exactly. That was the big eye opener for me as well. I think that, everyone's talking about this as a 100-year event and the vaccines curing all. But yeah, I think that the insights on the show were amazing. I know she's in Canada at the moment. I think she was just about to leave for Canada when we did the show. But yeah, no, absolutely great listening, great conversation.
I know. And there's some scary stats in there too, Jamie, which I think you'll all really, I won't say enjoy, but they'll certainly be educational. Enjoy watching.
Yeah. Good morning, Agnes. How are you?
Hi, I'm very well, thanks. How are you?
Good. How's your lockdown going? You're still in lockdown in the UK?
We're still very much in lockdown. The UK government has just published a kind of roadmap for exit, but it does feel like it's going to take some time still. So
we did 100 days, I think, in our last stint in Melbourne. Well, no, actually, our last stint was a 5-day snap lockdown, but we can certainly empathise with you and know exactly how you're feeling.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's pretty tough.
Yeah,
we've been watching the sort of easing of lockdown in Australia and New Zealand with a lot of jealousy over here. So yeah, very envious.
Well, I guess without further ado, we'll jump straight to the subject that is really, to Jamie's point in the introduction, is on everybody's lips. Now, the vaccine, we're starting to hear some interesting points raised around it, just out of the usual rollout information. But one of those is we understand that we'll need to perhaps be vaccinated on a yearly basis. Can you talk to us about that, how long it lasts for?
Yeah, sure. So one of the biggest or closest historical parallels to the current crisis is the 1918-1919 influenza pandemic, sometimes referred to as the Spanish flu pandemic. And the way that pandemic ended was that it became endemic. So it became just a kind of seasonal disease, much like the flu is today. That would come and go, was a lot less potent, a lot less deadly, something you would get every winter, you would usually recover from, but also once they developed flu vaccines, started to be vaccinated against it. And we still have strains of Spanish flu in circulation around the globe today. They're just not as deadly. In 1918, they kill people really quickly. Now they don't. And lots of people think that similar thing is going to happen to coronavirus. That it's going to become endemic, that it's going to become part of our everyday lives, that people will still get it, but hopefully won't be as potent, and that we'll have to vaccinate against it, much like we do with the seasonal flu, with variations. It will mutate every year, we'll need to develop a new vaccine or a variation of an existing vaccine to keep on top of it as we go forward.
So is there, we hear everyone talk about herd immunity. If enough people get it, there'll be a herd immunity. I think that Sweden's had a very interesting experience, that they all went for herd immunity and it was the right thing to do. It was a very Swedish thing. It's you can make the choice. And I think that hasn't worked out as planned. Is herd immunity going to be a thing? Are we all going to get to the point where we've all been vaccinated at the same time? Obviously, winter changes at each hemisphere. But are we going to get to that point or will we always have to continue to get the vaccine?
Well, the traditional definition of herd immunity, or what we usually mean when we talk about herd immunity, is diseases that we vaccine against. So this is where Sweden and in other places in Europe slightly went wrong, was that they kind of thought we can get to herd immunity without a vaccine. If we are going to get to herd immunity, we need a vaccine, and that vaccine might need to be updated every year. So herd immunity is something that, much like say something like measles, which is vaccinated against children. And the point about herd immunity is that there are always going to be kids and adults who can't be vaccinated for various different healthcare reasons. And the point about vaccinating as much people as possible is it means that those few people who can't be vaccinated are still going to be protected, because the disease isn't circulating in the same way as it would be if we weren't vaccinated. So I think the important thing about herd immunity is that it accompanies vaccination programs. It accompanies large-scale rollouts of vaccines. So we're not going to get to herd immunity without widespread uptake on a kind of global scale of the vaccine.
I mean, obviously that rollout globally is underway in various different stages in different countries. Are we going to see hiccups along the way through that program? Like how, I guess it's a bit of a controversial question, but how safe are the vaccines? I know there's lots of different types, but how safe are they as a whole?
I think these vaccines are very, very safe. Some of the safest that have been developed over the past sort of century. One of the things that often makes people nervous is the speed with which the vaccines have been developed. And the thing that's important to recognize about that is that it's not that they've been developed quickly because people have been slapdash. It's because lots of governments around the world have taken away the normal barriers to speedy scientific progress that would normally be in place. So they've got rid of the red tape, they've got rid of lots of the bureaucracy, but they've still been rigorously tested and rigorously researched. So they're very safe. But in terms of hiccups, I think that's absolutely something we have to bear in mind, that even the best medical intervention in the world, the safest, the most effective, has to work in tandem with societies. It has to have uptake. It has to have people have to place trust in it, and also there's loads of practicalities that governments have to encounter in rolling out a vaccine. You can have a great jab, but if a government can't kick itself into gear enough to deliver it to the people that need it, to do all of the kind of seemingly boring bureaucracy that is required with a public health campaign this large, the governments don't usually have to deal with, right? This is a hugely ambitious project, and some countries are dealing with it better than others. But even the ones that are doing the very best, like the UK where I am, is it's a surprise to everyone, frankly, that they seem to be doing so well in terms of how quickly they're rolling out the vaccine, considering how badly they've done in other ways when it comes to this
you can Brexit and get your vaccine at the same time.
Yeah, it's depressing, but also remarkable. And I think that there's a lot of optimism now in the UK that we're going to be out of this by June. Everyone's going to have been, the Prime Minister is promising that all adults in the UK will have been vaccinated by July, which does look like it might happen. But one of the problems with these things, and with optimism in general, is firstly, you can never predict how things might slow. You might have a lot of uptake by particularly older adults who spent the last year very much inside. Younger adults might not be so enthusiastic because they don't see themselves as such a great risk, and so they're not motivated by fear and anxiety in quite the same way. And also the big question as well is, if just because one country does a good job of rolling out the vaccine quickly and effectively, if the rest of the world isn't doing the same, as you both know, we live in a highly global world. We have constant movement of people across borders. And the global south in particular, like in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, South America, if those places don't have the same access to vaccines that the West and Australia and New Zealand have, then this isn't, the problem's not going to go away. This needs to be a kind of global effort.
So will there be sort of first world privilege going on as far as the travel goes? So, for example, if I lived in a different country whose government didn't actually roll it out as efficiently or as effectively as what I'd want, would I be effectively red carded or banned from travelling to other things? I mean, is that how you see it working out at the moment?
I think that is the way that global governments are going, with the kind of suggested introduction of vaccine passports, where you have to have a vaccine to enter certain nations, and that will inevitably work out discriminatorily. because there will be people in certain nations that haven't had access to the vaccine. I'm not inherently opposed to vaccine passports, but they need to be rolled out at a point when everybody in the world has had an opportunity to get it. Otherwise, they're only going to force, deep divisions in kind of global health, global economic access, etc. And I think we're already seeing a little bit of that in the quarantine rules that various countries have set up, and that you are allowed to enter certain countries, but you have to pay large amounts of money in order to be able to quarantine in government sanctioned facilities. And again, I'm not necessarily against that, as obviously we need to have drastic measures in order to prevent the global transmission of the disease. But equally, it does mean that if you are wealthy, if you're incredibly well paid, those things aren't actually obstacles to you. And similarly, with punitive systems that are very much based on fines, you do foster a division in society that the people who can afford to pay those fines, are just not curtailed by coronavirus restriction measures, and the poor are. And I think we have to think about that, even if we're not necessarily going to get rid of those quarantine measures. I can see their utility. We do have to be aware that diseases always deepen social inequalities. They have throughout history. Pandemics have unintended consequences. They kill people, but they also create rifts in society. And I think we're at a position now where we can think very carefully about how to minimize those sort of unintended consequences, that sort of social and economic fallout.
So we were talking about the herd immunity before, and so you said the vaccine was part of it, and there'll be a number of people who don't get the vaccine. You think that the argument for these people would be, well, look, everyone else is going to get the vaccine. We're going to get herd immunity. I don't actually need to step forward to get it at all.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about herd immunity is it accommodates the very small proportion of people who have, real health conditions that prevent them from getting the vaccine. And other people, like at the moment, the vaccine isn't approved in lots of places for pregnant women or breastfeeding women. So that's a kind of, it accommodates those people. That's what herd immunity sort of can manage, as it were. That's the kind of order of magnitude of the unvaccinated that it can cope with. It can't cope with, 20, 30% of a, highly diverse population like the British population. Yeah, exactly. It can, somewhere like the UK, they have something like up to 30% of people reported hesitancy around the vaccine. It can't accommodate that. So if you're going to have a successful vaccine rollout, if you're going to have a successful public health measure, you need to persuade a lot of those people so that you can accommodate the people who really can't get the vaccine, not through uncertainty or anxiety, but for real healthcare reasons.
Yeah.
So I guess the argument, therefore, really is that the vaccine is only part of the COVID-19 solution. Do you have any views on, what the other considerations should be for, I guess, globally, but I guess if we more think about it in the context of workplaces and remote working for businesses, is there any other considerations that should be taken into account?
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that's very tempting about that vaccine is to see it as this kind of like quick fix all, a kind of panacea that's just going to solve all of our problems. And I think it's possible to be both kind of very pro-vaccine, which I am, and also very skeptical of its, long-term. It's not our only solution. And there's obviously different countries have taken different approaches. Like you guys in Australia have obviously kind of sought a more zero COVID kind of outcome where you're really just not letting COVID into your country and you're not letting COVID spread. Britain has not taken that approach, and it's not been a very effective one so far. I mean, it is pretty shocking, I think, to a lot of British people that we've done so badly, I have to say, in terms of the deaths per capita, just the straight up figures of people who've died. And I think that we do need to, I think what people in Britain are probably only slowly coming around to the realization that even with the vaccine, we're talking about long-term alterations to the way we live and work, in terms of, freedom of movement, in terms of, large gatherings, in terms of the workplace as well. I mean, I do think that one of the things, and I'm by no means an expert on this subject, but I do think that a lot of workplaces are going to stay remote or predominantly remote, working online, in the UK going forward. And that is partly because, there's been a kind of cultural shift. And particularly if you work in a kind of professional office-based setting, the kind of setting where it's very easy to work from home, as long as you have the right, internet access and computer setup. I think that a lot of people have found that there have been positives in that shift in culture, not just negatives. And I think it's also proven to be much cheaper for companies. Lots of companies have relinquished their really expensive offices in central London. And you're already seeing things like sort of exodus from inner cities on behalf of young people. So lots of young people, there's been lots of coverage of this in the UK, people in their 20s and 30s leaving places like London and going to live in more rural places and smaller towns and villages, because they believe, and I think probably rightly, that going forward they're going to be doing a lot of their work from home.
It's interesting. I think that's a worldwide phenomenon, right? Like we're seeing exactly the same thing in Australia, and prices in rural areas and coastal areas have just gone through the roof. There's stories of houses that, are on the market for 24 hours and then they're sold. It is a worldwide thing, I think, and I don't think it's a bad thing. I think if you can go and live on the beach and not in the hustle and bustle of a city, then why not? Just a question in relation to the vaccine. So I understand that the majority of the vaccines, you'll get 2 doses. You have the first one, 6 weeks later, you get a second one, and you have a paper passport. I mean, do you think there's much consideration or thought being put into the levels of fraud that can happen with these paper-based passports? It just seems strange to me that I can have everything electronically on my phone, but I'm still carrying around, a paper-based, I suppose, COVID passport.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I don't know what other countries are doing, but in the UK, they're definitely talking about rolling out a digital version. So you'd have an app on your phone that you can use as a sort of passport into businesses or supermarkets or, large events. I'm quite skeptical that that's going to be that effective, if only because they've been so bad. The UK government has been so bad at our, we were supposed to be able to do all of this track and trace stuff through our phones. And that's been such an appalling failure. That I don't have a huge
billions on it. Yeah, nothing.
Yeah. And I have a COVID app on my phone, but I very rarely use it. It doesn't really work. So I'm sort of slightly skeptical that there'll be the kind of uptake that they need it to be for it to be effective. But I think fraud is a really interesting question. I mean, one of the other problems with something like vaccine passports, whether it's paper or digital, is that we still don't know that much about how these vaccines, how long they last. So, as you said, we're still talking about at the beginning, we're talking about potentially having to get a kind of booster jab or a different vaccine every year. And we don't know that much about how long the immunity conferred by the vaccine actually takes. We just haven't had the research on it yet. And we also don't know as much, although evidence is starting to emerge, about what the vaccine means about how transmissible the virus is. So we're pretty sure that if you have the jab, you're much less likely to get COVID, and if you do get it, you're much less likely to get a severe case of it. You're much more likely to survive. But what we don't know so much of is whether it makes you less likely to give it to someone else. So even if you don't have symptoms, can you still be a carrier? Which does slightly undermine the utility of a vaccine passport. The whole point about it is to show that you're, not going to be someone that can transmit the virus. And we also don't know how the vaccine works for the new variants that are emerging. And there will inevitably be more new variants. And so we know that the vaccine is very, effective against the original variant, but this variant that everyone in the UK is really furious has been termed the UK variant. It's proven to be a lot less effective against, and similarly with the variant emerging from South Africa. And so, paper or otherwise, fraud or otherwise, even the most legitimate version of a vaccine passport, might not actually confer the kind of security that people want it to.
I think one of the other challenges with the rollout of the vaccine program as well is that it's obviously all government based. And so one of the things that we're seeing from managing global workforce and global staff is that there were a large proportion of individuals who either by choice or either by bad luck, got caught in locations other than their home country when COVID ran out, and they've been struggling to come back ever since. And so I wonder whether you have any view or insight into how either countries caretake other citizens from other countries, or whether there is a view from even the UK government around how they're going to manage, for example, UK citizens who are displaced into other countries, and getting them access to either the government-led organisation program that's being run out in that particular country they're in, or whether there's going to be a requirement for everybody to try and get home, which has its own hurdles with passenger caps and airline availability. Are you seeing anything around that?
I mean, it's a very interesting question, and also something that feels very personal, because I'm due to be moving to Canada for work next week.
Right.
And I'll be leaving the UK well before I'm entitled to the COVID vaccine here, but I'll probably still be in Canada when I get a text message saying, oh, you can come and get your vaccine. And I have no idea yet how that's going to work, whether I'll be able to get the vaccine in Canada, whether I'll have to come back to the UK, whether I have to wait. And at the moment, travel restrictions into Canada are very robust. So my ability to move in and out is going to be quite restricted. So I'm very interested in that question. And I don't think that the government has thought about it particularly hard. And I think one of the things that has been quite noticeable in the kind of coexistence of COVID and Brexit is how disinterested the government is when it thinks about the kind of global distribution of British citizens, or the kind of global makeup of so many people's lives. So many people are abroad for work, so many people are in Britain from elsewhere for work, but also people have families that are distributed, all over the place. There's obviously close links between Britain and Australia. So there's lots of people I know personally who, whose partner is in Australia and they've not been able to see them for the past, over a year. And I think in general that one of the things that a lot of national based policies have not really thought about is that, real global distribution of citizens, which is bizarre since, we know that, right? We know that the world is like that now. And
that's what led to the spread.
Exactly. Yeah. So what it's not clear to me is it a product of, is that sort of slight amnesia or myopia on behalf of the British government? Is that partly tied up with their current political outlook? Obviously, Britain is, moving in a certain direction in terms of its, global isolationism, not wanting to be part of Europe anymore, having much stricter border controls, all that kind of stuff, trying to mimic the Australian system. And is that part and parcel of that, or is it just an oversight? Is it just a case they haven't really been thinking through, what people who aren't, who are stranded either in the UK or elsewhere, what are they going to do about them? And I think that governments do need to be slightly more compassionate about, the kinds of things that count as essential travel or essential movement. And I think seeing family and loved ones, as well as work, work in some ways, lots of places is, I'm one of the few people allowed to leave the UK at the moment because I have a job offer in another country, and I'm allowed into Canada for the same reason. And my job isn't essential. I'm an academic researcher, it's not like I'm a, frontline healthcare worker that, you could kind of see a rationale for. And I'll be going to Canada and working remotely. I'll be in, working from home for much of the first few months while their lockdown is still in still in place. So it's not like, I absolutely have to be there, but work does kind of trump a lot of these restrictions, and things that don't seem to trump those restrictions are all the other things that people need and want to travel for, like, seeing their grandchildren, or, seeing their partners, or reuniting with family, or whatever it may be. And I think that would, be good for everyone.
Keryn, I think that's a great question. I think that, you could sort of imagine that each embassy would sort of stock up and they'd do a little call out to everyone. You're a UK national, come on, line up, show us your passport and get the jab. Now, just obviously, Agnes, you're making your own Brexit, which is great. Now, will you quarantine in Canada when you arrive?
Yes, I will. So I'll be in the Canadian system is such that you arrive, you spend 72 hours in a kind of government sanctioned hotel. Then on pursuit of it, so I have to have a negative test before I board the flight. I get there, spend 72 hours in a hotel at my own cost. Then then I can get if I get a negative test, then I'm allowed out into the place that I'm going to be living. But then I still have to stay in there in quarantine, but just kind of a self-managed quarantine for a following 11 days until at that point then I get another test and then I can leave.
Right, okay. So that's 14 days. So it's interesting because in Australia, people turn up, they have to have 14 days in quarantine. They get tested multiple times. It's a government-approved hotel, which is fortunately something like the Intercontinental or the Sheraton. So not too bad, although, access to fresh air and balconies and windows, is obviously limited in some of these buildings. Now, I suppose leading on from that, my question is, do you think that quarantine is here to stay for an extended period of time? So people entering countries, do you think this is going to be the next 12 months, 24 months, 36 months? I don't know. I'm just interested to see what you think, because I don't know if you probably do know that my understanding is that when the Spanish flu was around, ships coming to Sydney Harbour, people would have to quarantine for 45 days.
Wow.
Let's hope this nice and get 45. 14 sounded pretty luxurious.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting because obviously the UK has just not followed that model until incredibly recently, when it's introduced these 10-day quarantines in a similar kind of government sanctioned facility, but only for people from very specific countries with, as they see it, a more high risk, which doesn't include Australia or Canada. And there's been lots of reports that if you enter the UK at the moment or prior to this new introduced kind of hotel policy system, very little happened to you. There's very little surveillance, people, and that's obviously not worked as a policy. But I think one of the main reason why they've been so slow to introduce things like that is that there's a huge amount of pressure from businesses and from employers that these quarantine measures are bad for business. They make it difficult for them to move around the globe. It's also tied in with lots of other things about Britain, that they see themselves as a sort of peculiarly kind of libertarian nation, not interested in curtailing the actions of their citizens, and also incompetence, right? Like they might have wanted to do better, but they just couldn't quite manage it. So I think that different countries are going to take very different stances on this. I think that somewhere like Canada is proposing that it's going to ease those quarantine measures, it's hoping to do so within, by September in the next, 6 months. I think Britain is going to try and do it for as little, the current quarantine measures are going to try and do it for as little as possible, because it's had a lot of pushback in Britain, saying that this is, a lot of people are very in favour of it and a lot of people are very against it. And I think that the current government definitely will cede to the people who are against it sooner than they will the alternative. So I think different countries are going to navigate that question differently. As far as I can tell, as far as I can see from an outsider, and it's always risk making predictions as anyone, but especially as a historian.
Hey, we're all as we go along,
Yeah. Yeah, no one knows what's going on really, do they? But I would say that, it looks to me like somewhere like New Zealand isn't going to relinquish its, excellent record easily, right? It's going, I think that they're in this approach for the long haul. Even if they start easing up with the vaccine. I think that's the thing, right? Is that the vaccine is going to be a pathway out of this. And that's the kind of goal. So it might be that you have to quarantine if you're not vaccinated, but if you are, then you might not. But again, that comes with problems, as I mentioned before, about, what kind of evidence we have underpinning the reliability of the vaccine, the long-term reliability of the vaccine.
And then that kind of make me think about, where does the responsibility sit when it comes to, ensuring that that a traveller is vaccinated? Does it ultimately come back to the individual? If they get on a plane, then they're fully acknowledging the fact that, to your point, there might be pathway door A or door B. You can take door A if you're vaccinated and door B if you're not vaccinated. Or, in the context of workplaces, do you see that there is some level from almost like a workplace relations perspective responsibility that falls onto the organisation to make sure that that they have rules and governance around their business travel portfolios to say, look, we're not going to give you the luxury to choose A or B. The requirement is for you to be vaccinated if you want to participate in travel within this particular organisation. Can you see businesses getting to that stage?
I can see that happening, and I think that as long as those sorts of rules and regulations are accompanied with appropriate support for people, I think I think that's a good thing. I think if a business is requiring its employees to move around the world for whatever short term or long term, then they have a duty of care to those people as well, which is true in non-COVID times as well, right? You want to make sure that your staff are well equipped to make that journey, to move to a new place, that they're supported in that move. And COVID just needs to be added to that roster of the duty of care, that they're in a position to be like, provide adequate advice, support, answer people's questions. It may be that big companies will need like a kind of dedicated vaccine sort of steward, someone who's there to kind of answer people's questions, direct them to appropriate information. I think that is going to be, obviously businesses can't solve all the problems of society and healthcare systems and global governance. They can't. There's only so much any individual organization can do. But I do think that they can help their workforce navigate this new world, especially if they are requiring them to effectively put themselves at risk, right? Then they need to follow through with some supportive measures.
True. But with everyone moving at different speeds, every country has sort of had their own little COVID plan. There still seems to be a lot of confusion, even the fact that there's a number of different vaccines and do this or do that, or don't do this or don't do that. Do you see that, people are going to get in step with each other, or countries and governments will get in step with each other and actually start walking together with this, as opposed to all sort of on their own little path? It is like a little race, right? They're all just confusion, all running around like the house is burning down. Do you think it's going to get to that stage? I mean, are there governments who are already starting to talk about, well, let's synchronize what we're doing? And do you think that's going to happen? I suppose.
I mean,
that's a good question, Jamie, because it will impact whether it's business travel or personal travel. It's going to impact that race or that inequity.
Yeah,
the approach is going to impact how we all globally move once again. Good question, Jamie. Sorry, go ahead.
No, absolutely. It's a great question. I mean, I would say that I would like that to be the case. I would like countries to start communicating. I mean, one of the things you saw quite recently, so the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine that was developed in the UK and is in lots of ways a really great vaccine, because you don't have to store it at the really, really low temperatures that you do with the Pfizer, BioNTech or the Moderna vaccines, that it's much more easy to transport. You can roll it out in places that have far fewer resources, don't have access to electricity. It's just much easier to navigate and manage. And also that's true in more rural parts of the UK. But there have been some questions about its efficacy. And there's been a lot of sort of anxiety recently that some of those questions have been politically motivated rather than scientifically motivated. So France has been very critical of the efficacy of the vaccine, as has Germany. And there are lots of people who say, well, the reason they're so critical is because we're, running through Brexit, and that this isn't just about, reasonable concerns about the quality of a drug. This is about discrediting the UK government's efforts. And I don't know whether that's true, but that those sorts of conversations are even happening suggests that we're not approaching this, in a collaborative, global compact kind of way. This is still very much, countries thinking about their own borders, thinking about their own citizens, and not being that interested in what happens, next door. And that's, one thing when you're talking about Europe. But when you're talking about, the global South, or countries that don't, lower countries with fewer resources, they need to be. This needs to be a global effort, and they need to start communicating with each other, and they need to start bringing everybody along with them, because otherwise it's just counterproductive. It doesn't do anyone any good. If Britain manages to vaccinate its entire population, but no one else in Europe, let alone, India has, then it has a very limited impact on, it means that Britain will have to have incredibly firm borders, and people don't want that. And it's not going to be good for Britain in the long run, let alone the rest of the world. So I'd love countries to start, falling in line with each other and thinking about this as a kind of shared challenge. Not that optimistic, but maybe that's just me being cynical. I don't know.
It's the politics internally, the two opposing parties that are politicizing it rather than just coming together and getting on with it.
Well, Jamie, I mean, we're seeing that even within Australia that happens. So it's, I guess we've all got to get our houses in order first before we can unite as a globe. But I guess just on that point in relation to history, and so, for example, the Spanish flu you mentioned earlier, is there any record or I guess any evidence around how that political side was influencing, or how the nations perhaps came together? Anything we could learn?
Spanish flu isn't a great example of that, but polio vaccines are a really, have got some quite close parallels. So in the 50s, the new polio vaccine was developed in the US, and then pretty much most of the Western world started vaccinating its populations. And they were very similar. People in the UK like to talk about the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine as the British vaccine, a kind of sense of vaccine nationalism. And they did very similar things with respect to polio, where the American vaccine, Britain wouldn't roll out the American vaccine because they didn't trust Americans, basically. And there wasn't really any problem with the actual vaccine itself. They just wanted their own sort of homegrown version. And this massively delayed the rollout in the UK. It took years rather than months. And there were multiple polio epidemics in Britain that killed children, caused lifelong disabilities that could have been avoided by more effective international collaboration. Similarly, in Denmark, they created their own kind of Danish vaccine. And this is, again, going back, frustrating as a historian to see these things play out, and then you watch the world just kind of like, this isn't, this information is out there, right? It's not particularly, there's all these historians out there who love talking to people about their work. It's not like it's hard to find. And so I think that's something, I mean, the big counter example is the smallpox, the eradication of smallpox, that really was a global effort. And that was eradicated in 1980 by the World Health Organization. But that was a Herculean task, right? That took 10 years. It cost 20% of the WHO's budget. It required a huge amount of human power and expertise. And that worked, right? That did, they successfully eradicated smallpox, but they've only managed to do it once. This is the only disease they've ever eradicated. And if we want to eradicate coronavirus, then we have to, that's the kind of effort we're talking about. I don't think anyone is anywhere near thinking about that degree of international cooperation or that degree of financial and labor investment.
What do you think is different between smallpox and the coronavirus? I mean, why can't we look back in history and say, well, hang on, we pulled together here, we eradicated it, yay us. And then at this stage, they're like, okay. And I mean, if you look at Brazilian president, he said, the Pfizer vaccine will turn you into crocodiles. It's bloody unhelpful. But the thing I just don't understand why they wouldn't look back and use that as a model. I mean, the WHO, as you said, if they had 20% of their budget allocated to doing that, why haven't they been the leading voice and said, hey, well, we've done it in this instance, the model works, let's replicate it with this? Yeah.
Well, I mean, one thing I'd say is that the model works, but it does take 10 years. So, so we're
good.
And the other thing, I mean, there are several differences. One, smallpox and coronavirus are very different diseases. Smallpox kills a much larger proportion of the people who are infected. We're talking closer to 50% of people who contract smallpox die. There are far fewer people who are asymptomatic carriers when it comes to smallpox. So if you get smallpox, you're very likely to have very visible symptoms. You have all these pustules all over your face and hands. So it's really easy to identify cases. Obviously, the problem with coronavirus, and also a good thing about coronavirus, is often in many cases it's asymptomatic or very mild symptoms that can be easily mistaken for something else. Like I've had so many COVID tests this last year. I've never had COVID, but I've had every time I get a cough, I'm like, well, this is it. Or a temperature, the symptoms can be easily mistaken for other things. It's not quite the case with smallpox. It's a very different disease. So it's much easier to identify, to track, to contain, and to sort of control. The other thing, and this is a kind of more political thing, is that when this smallpox eradication campaign started in the 1960s, the WHO had way more power. We're talking about a very different political situation. It's relatively soon after the Second World War. You have much more robust social democracies, you have much more robust welfare states, and you have much more robust global collaboration. Because even the Soviet Union was one of the biggest drivers of the smallpox eradication campaign. And even in the height of the Cold War, they were able to kind of collaborate with the US on this issue. So I think there's a kind of, there's both sort of biological reasons why smallpox and COVID aren't necessarily exactly the same, and also political reasons why in some ways the 1960s was a better setup for this kind of large scale global collaboration. I mean, the WHO has a fraction of the budget it had proportionally in the 1960s. We've massively defunded the WHO. The US withdrew all of its funding under Trump. So if you want a global coordinated effort in response to disease, you need to equip those organizations that are set up to manage global disease, effectively. And unfortunately, people weren't thinking ahead. Governments weren't thinking, well, the next thing that's going to happen is there's going to be a global pandemic. And we need to make sure that we have shored up our biggest, sort of defense against that, the WHO, and they didn't.
Let's hope they've learnt their lesson.
Yeah, let's hope, because there will be another pandemic. I mean, I think that's the really depressing thing, is that we're talking about this is our future now. There will be more pandemics, more virus variants.
Sorry, Keryn, but that absolutely rolls into the next question that was in my mind. As the population grows, we're more densely populated. There's more people interacting and international travel. Do you think this is the first of many pandemics, and rather than waiting 100 years for a pandemic, do you think there'll be another pandemic of a different variety in a shorter period of time?
Yeah, I mean, I think current modelling says that there's likely to be a new pandemic every 5 years.
Oh,
wow.
On to our next.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, as we said before, it's impossible to predict these things. Hopefully that's not true, that doesn't work out. But I think we are looking, as you said, the way that we live now really is prime. It is the ideal setting for new viruses to develop and mutate. And I think one of the things that perhaps is being slightly overlooked in the current conversation about the pandemic is its root causes, and thinking not just about how we can prepare. I mean, hopefully that we will learn our lessons from this one, and that when we come to the next one, we'll be much more efficient about developing a vaccine, much more efficient about putting in place social measures, that we'll be able to manage it in a way that we haven't really managed this time around. Because there's been historical precedents, but not for a long time, not within living memory for most people, pretty much everyone in government. So it's also understandable that they haven't managed to, people were ill prepared for this. But hopefully with the ones that will come in the future, we will be better prepared. But I do also think we need to think, I mean, one of the reasons, one of the big causes, as everyone sort of knows, is that the keeping and consumption of animals and the scale and in the intensity that we have done has been the source of pretty much every new virus variant that we've encountered, from swine flu, bird flu, coronavirus, MERS. They've all originated in the kind of intense farming or husbandry of animals. And I do think that that's something that we have to, I'm not saying that we have to all become vegetarians, but I do think we have to think carefully about how we managed our environment, that viruses are a product of the planet, and climate change and pandemics are will go hand in hand, and we need to, if we tackle one, we'll hopefully be able to tackle the other as well.
Definitely.
Wow, I feel like we could spend another hour just talking about that and getting to the root cause.
I know we ended on a depressing note. I didn't.
No. For me, the last couple of points have kind of really given me a lot to think about. So I really appreciate it.
15 years ahead of the game on the vegetarianism. Don't worry.
You are.
I mean,
You are.
I am actually a vegan, so I feel like I always get into hot water when I start talking about that, because I don't want to sound like an evangelist, that I'm really
personally
campaigning
motivated.
for.
You've got a friend in Jamie, don't worry.
You're in such good company. I can tell you, I'm so against factory farming and the whole, salmon, and obviously this is sort of on topic but off topic. Is that your child screaming out, Keryn?
Yes, it is.
Got it. Salmon farming is the same thing, right? Because there's such a dense, salmon aren't meant to be farmed, and such a dense group. And so once there's a disease that goes through, as you'd probably know, it just it destroys everything. And I think this whole factory farming thing, it's just not natural. Even this volume of people on the planet, we're in such crowds. It's just, I don't know.
Well, not anymore. All the 20 and the 30-year-olds have moved.
Have left, yeah.
So maybe it's actually resulted in some positive things.
Yeah. I mean, if you're feeling optimistic, I do think that there is, potential, like for societies to change, you do sometimes need a big shake-up. You need something that resets things and makes people reconsider what's important and how to navigate, the world around us and all that kind of stuff. So, if you're being optimistic, you could say, well, this is an opportunity for, nations and the world to rethink how they function and to think about, a more environmentally friendly, a more, compassionate, humane, a more, a more collaborative, global order. Whether that happens, I don't know, but yeah, I think it's an opportunity as much as it is a tragedy.
Dr. Agnes Arnold Forster, it's been an absolute pleasure. As Keryn said earlier, I could talk all day about this stuff. I've got so many different questions, so many thoughts, but we only have a limited time. You obviously have a day to get to. It looks like the sun's coming up there, and as I said, we just really appreciate your time. We appreciate your wisdom and your thoughts. It's been absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, completely agree.
My pleasure. Absolutely my pleasure. It's been a real joy. Great start to the day to talk through some of these big issues.
Have a great time in Canada. I hope you're
Thank you.
you beat the virus over there, and or get your shot from the British government.
Yeah.
We
wish you safe travels.
Thank you so much.
Look after yourself.
Have a lovely evening wherever.
Exactly.
We will. Thanks, Agnes.
Right.
See you.
There you go.
Bye.